This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 333 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting into the 10 trends this week, I wanted to send another reminder about FanDuel's Santa Streak contest. It runs through the 21st, and all you have to do is finish in the top 50% of an eligible contest to build your streak. If you do, then great. Your streak continues. If not, your streak ends and you can start a new one the next day. At the end of it all, you'll be rewarded based on the length of your longest streak, and the user with the longest streak out of everyone will win the grand prize. So you still have time to create your longest streak. Just head to FanDuel.com and get started. Trend 1 this week is that Julio Jones had a freaking 51.3% target share on Sunday. 51.3%! And here's the crazy thing. In that same game, George Kittle had a 51.5% target share. Absolutely insane usage. The Julio usage is more interesting to me because it was the first game that we saw him without Calvin Ridley this year. There really isn't a strong second option on that team, so we could see a really high target share from Julio again here in Week 16. Not that high, but a projection above 30% isn't insane given the current state of that team. Since becoming starter again in Week 7, Ryan Fitzpatrick has averaged more fantasy points per game than Patrick Mahomes and Russell Wilson. Now clearly the Mahomes piece to this trend has to do with him leaving a game early with an injury, because when you remove that game, Mahomes is 1.7 points per game better than Ryan Fitzpatrick during this stretch. But Fitzpatrick's been better than Russell Wilson. And he's better than a ton of other quarterbacks too. I just had to mention Wilson because he's the biggest name. As I mentioned on yesterday's 15 Transaction show, Fitzpatrick is a top streamer yet again this week. Over the last 4 weeks, Tyler Higbee's seen 24.7% of the Rams' targets per game. He's had almost a 25% target share per game. During this 4-game stretch, Cooper Kupp's target share is 16.7%. Kupp's share this season before those 4 games was 25.5%. This is something that I mentioned last week with Kupp, but Higbee's work in the offense is what I want to focus on today more. According to Pro Football Focus, Higbee's 6th in the NFL in routes run over this time, and he's top 5 in yards per route run. He's been really, really good, and even though there's a tough matchup this week against San Francisco, it would be tough to bench him at this point as long as Gerald Everett is still out. Trend 4 is that since Week 9, DJ Moore leads the NFL with 711 receiving yards. Now, Michael Thomas has averaged more yards per game during this stretch, but DJ Moore has been balling out, and I feel like it's not getting enough recognition, especially given his environment. Look at who's throwing him the ball. Hopefully he's going to be able to continue to do so with Will Grier under center during championship week, but I'd have a hard time benching DJ Moore despite that ambiguity at quarterback. Now, speaking of Michael Thomas, this next trend is an awesome one that I saw from my buddy Ryan McDowell at RyanMC23 on Twitter. It's that Michael Thomas on the season has scored more fantasy points than all Philadelphia Eagles wide receivers combined. Michael Thomas is sitting with 335 PPR points right now. He's dominating fantasy football. He's dominating real football. And by the way, that 335 point total, that's more than what the leading wide receiver had in 2018, 2017, and 2016. And there's still 2 more games to go. In Week 15, Tennessee ran 54 offensive plays while trailing. During their previous 4 games, they ran 49 plays on offense while trailing combined. Derrick Henry was average for the first time in over a month this past week. And I think a lot of people are going to blame the hamstring. But there was touchdown variance because he was stuffed at the goal line a couple of times. And Tennessee doesn't utilize Henry all that much when they're trailing or when they're in a hurry-up offense. This was always my fear with Henry, but then Ryan Tannehill entered the picture, and the Titans became one of the most efficient offenses in the league. But if they see a negative game script, that fear is always there with Derrick Henry. I just wish that they would use him more in the passing game and get him into space, because we know that he's a monster with the football in his hands. Josh Allen currently has 18 passing touchdowns and 9 rushing touchdowns. Only Cam Newton and Cordell Stewart have finished the season with 20 or more passing touchdowns and 10 or more rushing touchdowns. Cam Newton's actually done it twice. Now, we know that the allure from a fantasy perspective with Josh Allen is that he's going to give you fantasy points with his legs. On the year, 37.6% of his fantasy points have come via the ground. That's the second highest in the league behind only Lamar Jackson. And it's less than 2 percentage points below Jackson. It's pretty close. So Allen's really benefiting from rushing production. It does seem like this could be somewhat sustainable, the same way that we've seen it with Cam Newton. I actually think that that's not a bad comp in general with how these guys score fantasy points. And it wouldn't surprise me if Josh Allen's one of my favorite quarterback values next season, as long as his ADP doesn't skyrocket. Josh Allen and Kyler Murray. But I do have a feeling that the fantasy world is going to catch on to rushing quarterbacks and raise their ADP more than I'd like. Baker Mayfield is currently averaging 13.9 fantasy points per game. If he finishes there, he'd produce the second worst points per game average by a top 5 quarterback pick since 2011. That's top 5 quarterback by average draft position. The worst, for those of you who are wondering, was Peyton Manning back in 2015. So if you drafted Baker this year, first off, shame on you for not living that late round quarterback life. But I'm sure your fantasy teams are hurting enough. Trend 9 this week is that no team has scored fewer tight end points this season than the New England Patriots. I think a lot of people would attribute this to Rob Gronkowski, but New England was 26th in the league last year in tight end fantasy points. So it's not like they were that much better. Gronk's retirement definitely didn't help though. New England's currently second to last in the league in tight end target share, ahead of only Arizona. They're just not utilizing their tight ends all that much. Now the final trend this week, and really the final trend of the season, is that Odell Beckham has just one top 10 performance on the year in 14 games. That's a rate of 7.1%. He's given fantasy managers a top 10 performance in just 7% of his games. In his 59 regular season games with the Giants, he had 26 top 10 performances. That's a rate of 44.1%. So he's gone from a 44% top 10 rate all the way down to a 7% rate with his move from the Giants to the Browns. There's no doubt he's one of the biggest fantasy busts of this season. That's going to do it for today's show. Thanks to all of you guys for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. And as always, if you listen to the show on Apple Podcasts, do me a huge favor and leave a rating and review. Thanks, everyone. I'll be back in your ears tomorrow with the weekly matchup show.